put together a plan to assist the community and to help with the integration of this shelter in the neighborhood?
That's correct. For the last 12 months, there has been a team working with a community liaison committee to look at services in the area and different recommendations from the community.
And the community has been involved?
That's correct.
Okay. And the beds were reduced from 100 beds to?
The initial occupancy is 50.
You concluded your questions, Councillor. Thank you. Any more questions of staff? Okay.
So just to be clear, I understand the notion of a temporary use, and I understand that things will revert back to normal in the longer term, and we're talking about 10 years. But I just want to make sure I understand Councillor Nunziata's original statement, and that is that when this thing went, I thought it went through a zoning process, to be honest. They had numerous consultations with the community, as opposed to just putting it in on an emergency basis. And my question is, on what basis was it put in? Emergency, yes, but did they have a time duration? Did they communicate to the public that the time duration would be 1, 2, 3 years? What? Well, if that's the case, what are we grappling with? If they were told that it would be on a temporary basis, but over a fairly lengthy duration, so what are we wrestling with here?
I will speak to that question when it comes time for speeches. I certainly will, if others don't want to. But does somebody want to send the staff? That was a question to the staff, not to me. As to what the public were told about the duration, that was the question.
So the public were told that it was a temporary shelter until the George Street George Street Revitalization project was complete, which would have been in the mid-2020s.
All right, so we're being consistent reasonably. That's fine. Thank you.
Are there any further questions of staff? All right, speakers. Councillor Nunziata.
Yes, I have a motion. What Councillor Palacio will move for me is that it be for 10 years with no options. It's on the screen. First of all, I really don't think it's fair that we should mislead the public and even mislead the committee here. First of all, when staff mentioned that there's services in the area, there are absolutely no services in the area. We're going to be spending millions of dollars to bring those services in. There's no services in Ward 11. There's no services along St.
No, I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because when we had an incident just recently at City Council involving a member who talked about staff misleading people. And I don't find that to be parliamentary language. That's certainly not acceptable to me as chair of the committee. And so I would like you to withdraw the fact that our staff are misleading people if you want to find another way to put that. But it's just not right and fair that we should have our professional public service accused of misleading people in this committee or anywhere else.
I will withdraw the comment, but Mr. Mayor, this is what happened a year ago when we had the public meetings, the same thing. The staff presented my community with all these services, and they were all vacant lots. So we continue, and this is frustrating for me because we keep saying things and they're not there. As far as transit, there's no transit on St. Clair. There's a bus on Runnymede. So as far as we have enough transit in the area, we don't. We were communicated to my community that was a temporary shelter. And that's what they bought into. Originally, it was 100 beds. We got it down to 50 beds. They're all happy about that. They accepted that. This was a year ago, the negotiated lease. It's been a year later. We haven't been able to negotiate with the lease, with the landlord. The landlord's been very difficult. He's been going around communicating to my residents on the city negotiating the lease. There was private information that the landlord was communicating to the public. So my residents knew all about the negotiations even before the city knew, or even before I knew. So my community is very frustrated because they were told it was a temporary shelter. It was 5 plus 5. And now we have a lease because the landlord refused to sign the lease. We're paying them an extra month's rent, we're paying thousands of dollars in renovations, And as well, we have to extend the lease an additional 5 years because the landlord won't sign the lease. So what are we doing? Are we catering to these landlords? Or are we just throwing away money because landlords know that the city needs a shelter, so they're playing these mind games. They know that whatever they ask for, they're going to get. And that's going to continue for any future shelters. So I'm encouraging the committee to please support the motion that Councillor Palacio will move on my behalf. We have to be truthful to the residents. We can't continue without giving them false information.
Thank you, Councillor Seattle. Other speakers? Councillor Palacio?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will move that recommendation on behalf of Councilor Sierra. As I mentioned while I was asking questions, I was part of this two public meetings, massive public meetings that took place in Councilor Sierra's area, and I was invited to attend by residents in my own ward as well. And somehow, through the questioning aspect, and the community was led to understand or believe that the lease was going to be for 5 years and perhaps an additional 5. And that was said over and over again. And I think that when we're consulting with our local communities, and that it's extremely important not only to inform them about what's going to take place, and when we're taking also community input, but to try to bring that sense of comfort in whatever way that we can. Now, this part of St. Clair is extremely depressed, and that section of Runnymede. In terms of with planning, there has been a tremendous pushback and putting the brakes on growth and development through OMB appeals and whatever. So the community is literally suffering. Together with Councilor Sierra, we've been trying to work compromises all throughout to get some level of revitalization in the community there. But our city planning staff have dug their heels and on the notion of no further changes and all kinds of restrictions. So there is a need to do something there. Now, one thing that's very important, members of council, to understand is that there is a high concentration of poverty in this area, and the area is in need of revitalization. This area has been declared by, and it went through council as a neighborhood improvement area, is with a very low equity score in relation to other communities. Here we have a score of 11%. When you look just a few blocks down by Blue West, we have an 85% equity score. So this this shelter, even though that there is a need for it, but the location is not the proper location. I even offer a place in my own ward. So this area is not only that they are suffering because of the stigmatization that's taking place, and due to the level of poverty, drug dealing, crime, and level of uncertainty, but I think it's only fair to be truthful to what we say, and I'm referring that, including members of council when we talk to our communities. So hopefully that this recommendation will be hopefully supported. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Other speakers? Councillor McMahon?
Well, I'll just say that it's very frustrating when we discuss shelters, and there's still such a stigma with residents and with councillors, I'll say. And I think we need to be more open-minded and supportive of shelters, and we need to be more respectful of city staff. They work hard, and it's not easy finding a location for a shelter. It takes a long time, and we've seen a lot of the not in my backyard mentality, and I think we need to do more education and more outreach to combat that. It's my understanding there are services around this location. I was at CDR to hear the deputations for this shelter, and I just think we need to embrace the concept of helping each other and supporting shelters.
Councillor Giorgio?
Very quickly, Mr. Mayor, ironically, North York had a bylaw that didn't permit shelters as of right, whereas the rest of Toronto permitted shelters as of right. And in my own area, even though a shelter was not permitted, it went in on a temporary basis, no consultation, no meetings with the community, and I basically accepted the fact that there was a need for a shelter. I'm not saying it was the best location, I'm not saying there's great services around there, but like my colleague said, it's reminiscent of group homes when they first came on the scene in North York. We needed to accommodate certain things, and staff are very, very, I think, sensitive to finding locations that are reasonable to introduce shelters. I mean, they're as sensible as they can be in terms of working with the community to try and have the community embrace shelters, because they need to be embraced, unfortunately. So those are my comments.
Mr. Mayor, I just think this ties back to the last item, Councillor, the deputy on Councillor Mary Margaret McMahon's thing on how the city doesn't listen. They feel that they're not listened to. And so what I heard from Councillor Nunziata and Councillor Palacio was this is supposed to be a temporary use, right? And Councillor George was right, and so is Councillor McMahon. These things are not very easily accepted, and here we are, we're extending it out another 5 years. This is not the agreement that we had with the community. Firstly, they're asked to accept something that they really kind of don't want. But you send people in, you try and convince them, and you basically say it's going to be a temporary use. And now this report comes back and it says, we're going to extend it another 5 years. I think the community is right, and I think the councillor's right, to view this with a healthy degree of skepticism, if not suspicion. And I think I'm going to support Councillor Palazzo's motion. We said it was going to be temporary. It should be temporary. And that, because, 10 years turns into 15 years, and then, then what does it turn into? Temporary starts to become permanent. And that's not what they were told. And I think there was a bargain made with the community, and the community, had some serious concerns, and we should do the best that we can to keep that bargain.
Who else wishes to speak? Councillor Barlow?
I'll try to be brief. What is in front of us is actually the lease, and I know that we were going back to, is this the right location, not the right location? I think that we went over that, and there has been a lot of work with the local councillor to make it work in that location, because everybody agreed that it was going to be there. I think that the important thing is the community was told that it was going to be done, the shelter would be there until the George Street was done, which is minimum 2025. We have a lease that is going to give us a 3-year buffer, which we know all around here that, it's probably, it might be about right. By the time it's ready, we move people and so on, it might be about right. And then we have a 10-year option. So I think staff tried to do a deal that was the best for their money, given the circumstances, and that's what it's in front of us right now. I understand all the work that the councillor did, and it was an incredible work. I went with the councillor to the first meeting. It was a very difficult meeting. Absolutely, these things are never easy. That's why we're trying to work with staff to find a new way to deploy these shelters and work with these shelters. But what we have in front of us is a lease that is going to give us a shelter with a little bit of a buffer time, which we might use or not, as we heard from staff. But the commitment is the same. The shelter will